Imagine sitting in a quiet courtroom fighting for your freedom. You are facing 5 capital charges. If the jury convicts you, you will spend the rest of your days behind bars. The prosecution has just rested its case. Your defense attorney steps forward and calls the only witness who can possibly save you. You take the stand. This was the reality for 22-year-old Donald Andrew Sharp, a former live-in nanny accused of the unimaginable. But as he sat before the jury prepared to declare his absolute innocence, he faced an impossible problem. The most damning, devastating witness against him was himself. That witness was Donald Andrew Sharp himself. Through hours of recorded audio, the jury didn't hear a wrongfully accused man. They heard a predator weeping and confessing to his own atrocities. Sharp was 22 years old at the time of his trial. To the outside world, he was just a live-in nanny, a trusted cousin residing in a busy Palm Coast, Florida home, tasked with watching over 5 young siblings. But behind closed doors, Sharp was orchestrating a living nightmare. What makes this case so deeply chilling isn't just the sheer severity of the crimes. Sharp faced 7 devastating charges, 5 of them capital offenses, for the repeated horrific sexual assault of a 9-year-old girl and her slightly older brother. The true horror of this case lies in the absolute betrayal. This was a caretaker the victim's father loved like a son, a man who lived under their roof, hiding his dark urges in plain sight. And even more shocking is how the truth finally surfaced. There was no complex forensic puzzle. Instead, the most damning evidence came straight from Sharp's own mouth. In a gut-wrenching 2-hour phone call with a devastated father just moments away from open-heart surgery, and a 3-hour interrogation with detectives, Sharp laid bare his own depravity. He detailed the assaults. He admitted to bizarrely timing his encounters. And he confessed to forcing the young siblings to perform acts on each other while he simply watched. This is the story of a guardian turned monster, and how a dark web of secrets unraveled piece by terrifying piece. To understand the sheer magnitude of this betrayal, you have to understand the environment where it took place. The setting was Palm Coast, Florida. Inside a busy family home, 5 siblings were growing up together. Like any large family, it was a household that required structure, supervision, and above all, trust. Enter Donald Andrew Sharp. To the family, he was known simply by his middle name, Andrew. He wasn't a stranger hired off the internet. He was an alleged cousin. He was family. The children's father cared for him deeply, looking at the young man as if he were his own son. Because of this unbreakable trust, Sharp was given the role of live-in nanny. His primary responsibility was the safety and well-being of the 5 children under that roof. Among them were a 9-year-old girl and her slightly older brother. At an age where children look up to the adults in their lives for protection and guidance, these 2 siblings were placed directly into Sharp's care. But over time, the dynamics inside the Palm Coast home began to shift. The children's father remarried. With his new wife staying home to care for the kids, Sharp's services as a live-in nanny were no longer necessary. Yet he didn't leave. He lingered in the home, holding no job and contributing absolutely nothing to the bills. He spent his days doing nothing, simply mooching off the family that had taken him in. Eventually, the father's patience ran out. Shortly after Memorial Day in 2022, the family made a decision. Sharp was sent packing, relocated out of state to live with his grandmother in Huntington, West Virginia. When he walked out the door, a dark, suffocating presence left with him. The 9-year-old girl was secretly, desperately glad he was gone. For months, the house was quiet. The family moved forward completely unaware of the horrors that had taken place right under their noses. The 9-year-old girl carried an unbearable burden in silence, too painfully embarrassed and too young to fully comprehend the monstrosity of what had been forced upon her. Then the dam broke. Months after Sharp's departure, the young girl suddenly blurted out a terrifying truth to her stepmom. She revealed that her cousin, her caretaker, had been inappropriate with her. The revelation sent shockwaves through the family. The parents immediately contacted law enforcement, setting off an urgent investigation. But this devastating family crisis collided with a severe medical emergency. The girl's father was already facing a fight for his own life. He was scheduled for an intense open-heart surgery, a procedure so dangerous that he would later die on the operating table for 4 minutes before being revived. Facing his own mortality and carrying the agonizing weight of what had happened to his little girl, this father needed answers. And he knew exactly who he had to call. Asterisk, a home is supposed to be a sanctuary. For the 5 children living in that Palm Coast house, it was their entire world. But when the parents were away or occupied, the power dynamic shifted. The authority fell to Donald Andrew Sharp, and in those quiet moments, the sanctuary became a hunting ground. Because of his age and his status as a trusted family member, Sharp had unchecked access. He used that access to systematically dismantle the innocence of the children in his care. The primary target of his obsession was the 9-year-old girl. Sharp's actions were not fleeting moments of poor judgment, as he would later try to claim. They were calculated, repeated, and escalating acts of predatory violence. According to his own detailed confessions and the crushing testimony of the victims, Sharp subjected the young girl to severe and repeated sexual assaults. The abuse was comprehensive. He confessed to assaulting her orally, vaginally, and through anal rubbing. But there was another bizarrely chilling detail that emerged from his confessions. Sharp admitted that he would actually time his encounters with the 9-year-old. He was watching the clock, calculating his window of opportunity, ensuring he could carry out his assaults and slip back into the role of the devoted nanny before anyone walked through the door. But Sharp's depravity didn't stop at direct physical assault. He introduced a dark psychological torment designed to trap the children in a web of mutual shame. He didn't just target the 9-year-old girl. He also manipulated her slightly older brother. Sharp orchestrated horrifying scenarios between the 2 young siblings. He directed the boy and the girl to engage in sexual acts with each other. And while these 2 children were forced into this unimaginable situation, Sharp stood by and watched. By forcing the brother to participate, Sharp created a devastating cycle of guilt. If the children told their parents what Sharp was doing, the brother would have to confess to what he had done. It was the ultimate leverage, a masterclass in predatory manipulation. In fact, Sharp would later try to weaponize this very dynamic. He would claim that he was the one who caught the siblings acting inappropriately. He claimed he repeatedly tried to stop them, but the logic was fundamentally broken. In an entire year of this supposed behavior, neither the parents nor the other siblings ever saw anything. Only Sharp managed to catch them time and time again. And conveniently, he never once reported it to the parents. He just kept quiet. And so did the children. The 9-year-old girl was trapped in a state of painful embarrassment. She was too young to fully comprehend the monstrosity of the acts forced upon her. Her brother was paralyzed by a profound, agonizing shame. A shame so deep that years later, at 13 years old, he would completely melt down on a witness stand, unable to deny his own forced participation. For months, the abuse continued in the shadows. The children suffered in silence, terrified and confused. They shared meals with their abuser. They slept under the same roof. It was a perfect, horrific secret. Until the day Sharp was finally forced to pack his bags and leave for West Virginia. The predator was gone, but the trauma he left behind was a ticking time bomb. And it was only a matter of time before it detonated. When the 9-year-old girl finally broke her agonizing silence, her parents did not hesitate. The Flagler County Sheriff's Office was immediately brought in, launching an urgent investigation into the nightmare that had unfolded inside the Palm Coast home. But investigators faced a unique and daunting challenge. The suspect, Donald Andrew Sharp, was no longer in Florida. He had been sent away months earlier and was now living out of state with his grandmother in Huntington, West Virginia. To bring a predator across state lines and secure a conviction that could put him away for life, detectives needed more than just an accusation. They needed ironclad, undeniable proof. And to get it, they orchestrated a tense, high-stakes undercover operation. Before police knocked on Sharp's door, they needed him to drop his guard. They set up a controlled call, a telephone conversation secretly monitored and recorded by law enforcement. The person making the call would be the one man Sharp still thought he could manipulate, the children's father. But the circumstances surrounding this call were almost impossibly grim. The father was not just reeling from the devastating revelation of his daughter's abuse. He was literally fighting for his own life. He was scheduled for a massive open heart surgery the very next day. In fact, as he sat with the phone to his ear, preparing to confront the man who had assaulted his child, his heart doctor was actively calling him on another line. The tape began to roll. The father, pushing through unimaginable physical and emotional pain, pressed Sharp for the truth. Cornered, Sharp tried to minimize the damage. He muttered that things only happened a couple of times, but the father refused to let him hide behind vague excuses. He demanded accountability, asking point blank what he did and if he put his private parts in her mouth. Silence hung heavy on the line. Finally, Sharp replied that he didn't want to answer that. Desperate, the father pleaded. He said he just needed some answers and had to call his heart doctor back. It was in that moment that the facade finally cracked. Soaked in sobs and apologies, Sharp broke. He cried, saying he didn't know why he did what he did. He said it would sound stupid, but he didn't mean to do anything. Sharp continued trying to justify the unjustifiable. He claimed it wasn't much because every time he did anything, he felt awful. The father acting as a surrogate for the detectives, listening and zeroed in for absolute clarity. He asked, "So it was only oral, right? Yes or no?" Sharp's response was a single devastating sound. Law enforcement had their hook. They had a recorded confession to a horrific crime. But what happened next would seal Donald Andrew Sharp's fate forever. Armed with that damning audio, Flagler County Sheriff's detectives Dan Laverne and James Crosby boarded the plane. They tracked Sharp all the way to Huntington, West Virginia, arriving at his grandmother's house to finish what the father had started. The detectives sat the 22-year-old down for a grueling 3-hour interrogation. They didn't yell. They didn't physically threaten him. Instead, they spun a masterful psychological spiderweb. At the very beginning of the interview, they told Sharp they already knew what had happened. They explained they didn't want to put words in his mouth. They simply wanted to hear his version. The detectives acted as a human truth meter. They made it explicitly clear when they thought Sharp was lying and when they knew he was telling the truth. And Sharp made it incredibly easy for them. The stark difference between his clumsy deflections and the terrifying reality gave investigators all the leverage they needed. Hour by hour, detectives Laverne and Crosby pulled the thread, and Sharp unspooled completely. He didn't just admit to the oral assaults he'd confessed to on the phone. Over those 3 hours, he confessed repeatedly and in granular detail to everything. The ejaculations, the anal rubbing, the vaginal molestation. Back in Florida, the final pieces of the investigation fell into place. A child protection team specialist conducted a careful recorded video interview with the 9-year-old victim. Though she was painfully embarrassed by what had been done to her, she was heartbreakingly believable. Every horrific detail she provided matched the confessions the detectives had just extracted in West Virginia. The investigators had built an insurmountable mountain of evidence. They had the brave testimony of a traumatized child. They had the agonizing recording of a betrayed father. And most importantly, they had hours of Donald Andrew Sharp building his own prison brick by brick. The investigation was over. It was time for the trial. Asterisk, as the trial opened in Flagler County, the prosecution laid out an ironclad case. The jury sat through 5 grueling hours of devastating testimony. They heard the tapes. They watched the 13-year-old brother melt down in anguished shame on the stand. They listened to the 9-year-old girl painfully believable recount her living nightmare. It felt like an open and shut case. A predator caught in his own trap. But trials are rarely that simple. And Donald Andrew Sharp was not going down without a fight. His defense attorney, Spencer O'Neill, deployed a highly unusual legal tactic. In most trials, the defense gives its opening statement on the very first day. O'Neill, however, decided to wait. He reserved his opening argument until after the prosecution had completely rested its case. When O'Neill finally stood before the jury, he dropped a bombshell. He introduced a twist that completely flipped the narrative. His client, he claimed, was not a monster. His client was a scapegoat. The defense presented a deeply disturbing alternate reality. They pointed the finger directly at the children. Sharp claimed that the brother and sister were actually the ones repeatedly engaging in inappropriate sexual acts with each other. Sharp wasn't the orchestrator, his attorney argued. He was the one who kept trying to stop it. But this alternate theory had a glaring, terrifying hole. If Sharp was constantly catching these children in the act over an entire year, why did he never tell their parents? Sharp's excuse was shockingly fragile. He claimed he thought the behavior would just stop on its own. It was a desperate deflection. The state argued that Sharp was simply using the very abuse he had forced upon the siblings as a shield to protect himself. He was trapped in a snare, and he needed a way out. To sell this unbelievable story, the defense took the ultimate risk. They called their only witness to the stand, Donald Andrew Sharp himself. Taking the stand meant Sharp had to face the most impossible obstacle in the room, his own recorded confessions. How does a man explain away hours of weeping admissions to horrific crimes? Sharp's answers bordered on the absurd. When asked why he confessed to the girl's father, Sharp claimed he knew. The man was going into heart surgery and kept asking for peace of mind. Sharp testified that he wanted to give him the peace of mind he sought, whether it was the truth or not. He wanted the jury to believe that confessing to the brutal assault of a 9-year-old girl was an act of mercy for a dying father. A father who during his own testimony collapsed in sobs on the stand, looking as crushed as if he were hearing the news for the first time. And what about the 3-hour confession to the detectives in West Virginia? Sharp claimed the investigators simply wouldn't take any other answer. He testified that he just wanted to get it over with so he could go back inside his grandmother's house. But Assistant State Attorney Melissa Clark was ready for him. During a blistering cross-examination, she cornered Sharp with an undeniable fact. Several of the horrific details in his fake confessions matched the 9-year-old girl's accusations detail for detail. Clark looked at Sharp and asked the only question that mattered. Was it just a coincidence? Coincidence, Sharp replied. The tension in the courtroom snapped. The jury now had to decide. Was this the unluckiest scapegoat in the world, or a predator desperately grasping at straws? The courtroom air was thick with tension as Donald Andrew Sharp wrapped up his desperate defense. He had painted himself as a misunderstood protector, a victim of circumstance forced into false confessions by a grieving father and relentless detectives. He wanted the jury to believe it was all just a terrible, tragic coincidence. But the truth, raw and undeniable, was echoing in the very room. The climax of this trial didn't come from a surprise witness, bursting through the doors, or a sudden piece of hidden forensic evidence. It came from the absolute crushing weight of reality. The jury wasn't looking at a scapegoat. They were looking at a 22-year-old predator who had woven a web of lies so thin it disintegrated the moment it was examined. The defense's theory that the children fabricated the story to cover up their own behavior completely collapsed under the weight of logic. Why would these children, who were never accused of anything and had no reason to target, Sharp invent such horrific, detailed allegations? Especially when Sharp was already out of the house and out of their lives. The truth was that the 9-year-old girl finally felt safe enough to speak only because the monster was gone. And then there were the confessions. Assistant State Attorney Melissa Clark's cross-examination had dismantled Sharp's entire facade. A man does not accidentally guess the exact granular details of a child's abuse to simply give a father peace of mind. A man does not accurately describe the agonizing specifics of multiple assaults just to get back inside his grandmother's house. The jury saw through the deflection. Some jurors weren't even looking at him as he testified, his presence on the stand seemingly superfluous to what they already knew in their bones. The truth was revealed not by what Sharp denied on the stand, but by what he had already admitted in the dark. He was the architect of his own destruction. Donald Andrew Sharp was guilty. And the only thing left was for the jury to say it out loud. Asterisk as the trial entered its final hours. The gravity of what was about to happen settled over the courtroom. For the victims, the aftermath of Donald Andrew Sharp's betrayal was already a life sentence of a different kind. A family that had opened its doors to a relative was left completely shattered. The father, who had literally died on the operating table for 4 minutes during his heart surgery, survived only to face the crushing reality of what happened under his own roof. The 13-year-old brother was left grappling with an agonizing, unwarranted shame, forced into a trauma he never asked for. And the brave 9-year-old girl, whose painful but unwavering testimony finally brought the abuse to light, would have to spend the rest of her life healing from the monstrosity of a trusted caretaker. But what about the predator? What would the court command for Donald Andrew Sharp? Sharp faced a staggering 7 charges. 5 of those were capital offenses. In the state of Florida, a new law calls for the restoration of the death penalty for people found guilty of the exact crimes Sharp was accused of. But in a twisted stroke of legal luck for the defendant, that ultimate punishment was off the table. Because his crimes were committed before the new law took effect and due to a reigning 2008 Supreme Court precedent barring the execution of child rapists, Sharp would not face death row. Instead, he faced a different kind of finality. If convicted on even one of those 5 capital charges, the court's command would be absolute. A prison term for life. No escape, no more victims. On Thursday morning, the trial reached its end. The agonizing cross-examinations concluded. The defense and prosecution delivered their closing arguments, framing the sheer devastation of the evidence one last time. And then the fate of Donald Andrew Sharp was handed over to the jury. They were sent to a quiet room to deliberate. But given the sheer volume of evidence, it was clear this wouldn't be a drawn-out debate. They didn't just have the heartbreaking testimony of a ruined family. They didn't just have the sharp, undeniable logic of the prosecution. They had hours of Donald Andrew Sharp's own voice, weeping, confessing, and sealing his own fate. At the end of the day, as the jury prepared to render their decision and lock him away, everyone in that courtroom knew the terrifying truth. The man who had destroyed a family's innocence had ultimately destroyed himself. His strongest, most effective witness against him was him. The case of Donald Andrew Sharp is a chilling reminder of a terrifying reality. We teach our children to fear the unknown, to lock the doors at night, to avoid strangers in the dark. But what happens when the monster doesn't have to break in? What happens when he already has a key? When he eats at your dinner table, sleeps under your roof, and is loved like a son? The betrayal in that Palm Coast home was absolute. A family sanctuary was quietly turned into a hunting ground, and their deepest trust was weaponized against their most vulnerable members. Yet from the darkest depths of this tragedy, a profound courage emerged. A 9-year-old girl carrying a heavy, unimaginable burden finally found the strength to speak. In doing so, she didn't just expose a predator, she dismantled his entire web of manipulation. Her bravery, alongside the heart-wrenching vulnerability of her older brother and the relentless pursuit of a devastated father, forced the ugly truth into the light. Sharp believed he could control the narrative. He thought the profound shame he inflicted would keep his victims silent forever. But in the end, the very silence he relied on was shattered. And when the walls closed in, it was his own voice, his own weeping confessions, that forged the lock on his cage. True monsters rarely look the part. Sometimes they look like a trusted caretaker. Sometimes they look like family. And sometimes the only thing standing between a predator and his hidden cruelty is the brave, unbroken voice of a child.